All right, are we ready to get started? Yes. Sweet. Well, thank you all so much for joining today, all the people joining in person and all of our folks joining online. We're really excited for this event called Seizing the Means of Consumption. We have an incredible panelist over here that I'm going to let them introduce themselves. But before they do that, I want to say we've already started off. We want to be close. We want this to be conversational, a dialogue. People in the chat, please interact in the chat. People in person, we want this as much as we can to have a conversation. So please participate. We really encourage that. And without further ado, I'll lead it over to our panelists.
Welcome, everyone.
Hi. Hey,
I'm LJ. I use they, them pronouns. I am a campaign organizer with Decrimpovertydc. I am also a board member and volunteer with HIPS.
I'm Reagan. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the health equity manager at the Washington AIDS Partnership and also on the steering committee of the decrimpovertydc campaign.
Hey everyone, I'm Queen Adesui. I also use she, her pronouns. I just left the Drug Policy Alliance where I was there for 7 years, and I'm now with the Color of Change, but I'm also still on the steering committee of decrimpovertydc.
I'm just going to do things overview. You want to do the overview real quick? Because I'm going to talk about the drug policy.
Sure. You're going to do which part?
Just have the overview.
Oh, yeah. Okay, sorry. Forgive us, y'all. We don't have the screens all right in front of us. But so we're going to talk about a couple things today. We're going to start out by doing a brief history of drug policy and harm reduction. Then we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of harm reduction 101. What does it mean? Where does it come from? How do we apply it to our day-to-day lives? Then we're going to talk about the criminalization and decriminalization of substance use, specifically focusing on DC. We're going to talk about drug policy and the power that abolitionist theory and practice has to really change drug policy. Then we're going to talk more specifically about our campaign, decrimpovertydc, and then we'll open it up to questions from folks in person and online.
Yeah, and please feel free to ask questions as we're going, because we all are really passionate about this, so just feel free to just raise your hand and we'll answer anything. Maybe anything.
Yeah, this is getting formal, but this is a conversation, so please feel free to stop us and ask questions.
Alrighty. Brief history, drug policy and harm reduction. There's one of my favorite graphics. I feel like the people in the room will understand that one. Fuck Reagan. No, not you though. I love you. Yeah, no, we know what we're talking about. All right, so I spent all this time making this little graph, and drug policy. A war on drugs is a war on us. So I just want to lay the ground to really realize that drug policy has always been about targeting individuals and specific populations of community groups. It's really not about drug abuse as a problem, drug addiction. These are the terms that we hear from the state a lot, which now we're using terms like substance use disorder, which I'll get to. I like to start drug policy history at 1882. Does anyone know what was going on in 1882?
I don't know specifically, but I'm going to guess opium wars?
Yeah. Bingo. Opium, in general. Opium wars, opium, Chinese labor, immigration. There's a lot of themes around this, and there's always going to be a different theme, and they're basically all the same themes. It's going to be classism, economic insecurity, xenophobia, and racism. So Chinese laborers were coming in, they were working on the railroads, and people started being like, oh my God, they took our jobs, and they're fear-mongering, and they start to over-affiliate opium with Chinese immigrants. So that was a fear-mongering justification, opportunity to create a 10-year ban on Chinese labor immigration. And it was very classist because literally they're still letting doctors come over. It didn't matter. It wasn't just a Chinese ban. It was a Chinese laborer ban. And their justification was opium. They're bringing in drug use, opium dens. They're taking our white women because opium was mostly used by white women in the US actually. So that's an interesting fact. In 1909, they started doing smoking opium exclusionary acts. So the war on drugs didn't start until Nixon in 71. But the history of the United States has always had classist, racist, xenophobic drug policy. In 1914, we get the Harrison Narcotics Act. This is the first time the federal government starts to make narcotic control acts. So the federal government, United States, so states were already making things around what they were calling cannabis until a little later. they were making state laws around opium and cannabis. But 1914, the FBN is created. I'm not going to get into that, Federal Bureau of Narcotics, but they start to control opium and cannabis, opium and cocaine. They created transaction costs so high that it disrupted the supply chain. And what happens when you disrupt a supply chain? Someone fills it, black market, right? So we're already starting to see what happens when the government from up top is starting to be like, nah, we're gonna like seize the means, we're gonna take all this stuff away from you. People have used drugs for all of history. Before history was written, if we're thinking about the technical term of history being a written moment, we've been using drugs since forever. So when we start to criminalize drugs, pushes the market underground, it becomes unregulated, and we get the black market. Federal laws regulating and taxing it, and this actually inspired the National Prohibition Act, which brings us to 1919, which was when alcohol was prohibited, which is so hilarious because everyone's just like, yeah, alcohol is not a drug. They say like drugs and alcohol, but there was so much fear mongering around it, so much puritanical and classist, racist, like all that good stuff. So much of that was going on that the government did start to regulate the manufacturing, use, and sale of alcohol. Again, what happens? Black market! This time it was more through organized crime, like big scale organized crime. Gangs were really running everything. And that was a huge reason why the government was like, all right, we can't do that anymore. So themes again, classism and racism. At this point in time, the idea of addiction is still considered a vice. It's still the common idea that it is a moral failing, that it's like incurable, and it's something that bad people do. Do you have something to say?
No, go ahead.
I just have this random note. I'm going to add it in. I made it in italics. But anyway, in 1935, the Lexington Narcotics Farm got created. Like, literally, the U.S. government has been doing weird shit to people that struggle with substance use for so long. It was literally a penitentiary made for people that struggled with substance use. And they were targeted as actual testers. Like, they were testing different treatment models on people in this penitentiary. So I'm just trying to like lay the foundation of like what the heck has been going on in the United States with people who use drugs. So inmates were literally research subjects. The only good thing that came out of this, I even like hesitate to say that, is that there's this clear idea that we're starting to shift from this moralized idea and more of a scientific approach.
Was it, prisoners did they have like first consent or?
I don't think, no. It's kind of like once you're a prisoner, you don't really have consent.
I think they like occasionally, I'm from Kentucky. I think they would occasionally offer them reduction on their sentences if they would participate in the research, but that's not really done like really good.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, it's still coercive. But yeah, thank you. That does make a lot of sense. I mean, they still kind of do that with methadone, which is a harm reduction standard practice at this point. But I mean, if you know anyone who's been on methadone, a lot of people don't like it. And people still right now will get like reduced sentences if they go on to methadone or Suboxone. Especially, it's more sad for the people that do want to fully abstain and they're like, okay, I guess I'll take the medicine because they're then a liability. Around the same time that the Lexington Narcotics Farm is happening, Alcoholics Anonymous is starting to be created. So like people are really starting to scramble to be like, okay, we're dying here, we're not doing well, and the government's not going to do shit about it except hurt us. So like the theme's already there. By 1937, we see Marijuana Tax Act. Congress starts using taxing power to make weed de facto illegal. This is when marijuana starts being called marijuana, like legally, by the way. Everyone was like, yes, cannabis. People would just kind of say it as slang, where they'd say marijuana, but it was never in any federal documents. It was not legitimized. It was a specific target to Mexican people and Mexican immigrants, and also a way to just exotify it and like, just like the whole like crack cocaine versus cocaine, it's like this is a specific thing that specific people do, is the concept that that the government's trying to purvey. So it just legitimizes that term. The reefer madness, I'm sure y'all are familiar with. And ironically, Mexico actually prohibited marijuana like 27 years before this. So this whole idea that it's like, oh, it's the Mexicans, it's just like, such clear like such clear like social warfare. And actually recreational cannabis was very common in the United States before this. Again, xenophobia and racism, real popular things that are happening. People on the ground are still trying to find out ways to work on this outside of the government. We get some really weird models like Synanon, which was a drug rehab program, spin-off from AA. This is when we start getting like inpatient treatment facilities. And it was a really cool like inpatient group living thing until it turned into a violent cult. So Synanon is really fascinating. It's not our topic today, but if you're interested in like weird drug history, Synanon is really weird. Okay, guess where we're at now? We're in the 1960s. We start to get to the war on drugs, formally speaking. So under Nixon, crime control is a big deal. The Vietnam War is happening, and Nixon, in order to get like popular favor and to get voted in, he starts to really run with like, I'm going to be tough on crime, I'm going to be tough on substance use, and I'm going to help all of the Vietnam vets that are going to come back with an addiction problem. Last off, significantly less people came back with a substance use disorder than they suspected, which is just a huge testament to set and setting. Most of the people that ended up continuing their drug use were people that were already kind of screened for probably having, I don't know the best way to put it, but like screened for having like addiction problems. And like war is traumatizing, but like they weren't around their supply anymore. They weren't in an actively traumatizing moment. So they're like, hey, okay. They stopped using, which is also proof that like you can use a substance, and if your life gets better, you might stop using that substance. You're not inherently a bad person. Around the same time, methadone is becoming more popular. It's really starting to become this idea that like it's a biological thing rather than a personality defect, because if you can fix something with medicine, it means there's something in your body. Criminalization goes up. We get the 1970, criminalization efforts go up, not actually necessarily crime. 1970, we get the U.S. Controlled Substances Act. That's where we get drug regulations and scheduling. Scheduling is based on the potential for abuse, medical use, and it's ridiculous. Marijuana is still up there as a Schedule I drug, and I just have these stats from 2021. 108,791 people died from alcohol-related deaths in 2021. Alcohol is not scheduled at all. So if we're talking about potential for abuse or medical use, in 2021, for synthetic opioids, excluding methadone, so that includes fentanyl, methamphetamines, cocaine, script opioids, benzos, heroin, and antidepressants, 106,000 died. So all of those combined, it's still nearly 3,000 less than alcohol, which is just a great example of how ridiculous the scheduling is. And as we know, marijuana and heroin and cocaine have all been used historically and still to this day have potential medical use. 1971, we officially get Nixon's war on drugs, an increased measure for social control. He calls drug abuse public enemy number one. It's officially becoming criminalized on a wide scale. He's targeting specific populations of people, black people, leftists, hippies, and the working class white. And that's going to kind of be a huge theme moving forward now. And just like incarceration just rises. And it gets even worse somehow because we get Ronald Reagan in the 80s. So we're at the 1980s, we have Ronald Reagan's presidency, and we have his lovely wife's Just Say No program. And he vastly expands the war on drugs. This idea of just say no is also this great way to continue to target individuals, because if you just say no, the government doesn't have to fund programming. They don't have to fund treatment. If it's just a you problem and you just say no, like the government's good. We told you to say no. Again, it's just an expansion of the war on drugs, very individualizing, moralizing. And then in 1986, we get the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, when Reagan allocated $1.7 billion federal dollars to the police to fight the war on drugs. So if we want to talk about like healthcare and militarization, that's an excellent example of it. This is when we get the mandatory minimum, which I'm sure people may be familiar with. That's the 100 to 1, that 5 grams of crack is an automatic 5-year sentence, no parole, but it took 500 grams of powder cocaine to get the same sentence. Why? Racism, and classism. Definitely disproportionately and purposely targeted Black Americans. The statistics from nonviolent drug offense incarceration went from 50,000 in 1980 to 400,000 in 1997. Vast. I'm almost done with this spiel, don't worry. I just want to add a couple more points of just like general drug policy. In 1988, we're not just having the crack cocaine epidemic, we're also having HIV/AIDS. And people on the ground, this is kind of, Reagan's going to get into this history, but the federal government decides to actually ban the idea of needle exchange. People are doing that underground amongst each other. We're trying to save each other. Injection drug users and LGBTQ plus folks were like really on the front lines there. And there were some like public health officials and researchers putting their names on the line. That's how they got some of the resources. And then it got to the federal point and they were like, nah, it's not happening. There's a total ban on it. Clinton also refused to lift the ban. Obama like flipped a few times, and it's still, correct me if I'm wrong, it's still federal law, prohibited by federal law to use federal funds to purchase needles. So like when we say that we have like SSPs, like HIPSs and SSPs, sterile syringe program, safe syringe? Syringe, thank you. Oh my God, I'm supposed to be there. You should sit up here. But yeah, so like we can't actually use any of the government funds, but federal funds for the syringes, but we can use overhead costs now. And I'm sure it's not even actually allowed for overhead. Who knows what they're actually allowing it for. So yeah, this is going to be one of our hurdles with our campaign also, is like where we're getting our money from, and we have people working on that. In the Netherlands and Portugal, they were already doing it. 1980s, they're like, this is really effective. So whenever we talk about our evidence, we're looking at a lot of places in Europe and Vancouver. And then, so yeah, we do start to move into this more medical model. And the last thing I have to say is just this random note that in 2001, MAT regulations were always under the Drug Enforcement Agency and then gets moved over to SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services? Administration? Yeah, I don't do well with these letter things. But yeah, so we start to see this vast moment of criminalization, policing, but also some like little increments of community organizing and medicalization.
Can I, before you? Yeah, go ahead. I did just want to clarify though that the war on drugs was not a public health strategy. Like it actually was intentionally meant to target Black people and the anti-war left. Like there was never the thought, there was never any evidence to support it that criminalizing drug use would actually amount to better health outcomes for people who use drugs. It was very much a political strategy that really relied on stigma related to drugs, and then also racism and xenophobia and all the other isms. So definitely wanted to clarify that this was like intentional. And it was not like a mistake that the government made, a miscalculation about the benefits of criminalization. So it's much more insidious than like, you know, a mistake that happens and you just happen to have decades of harm from it. It was very much intentional. You can't arrest people for being Black legally, but you can arrest someone for using drugs.
Isn't there a quote that says decriminalize?
Yes.
Yeah, they have like
quite literally.
Like Bradford where they say
It's quite literally fact. Yes, it's not an opinion. Like this is very much a racist tactic of the government that happens to continue on today, and like now we're seeing the continued harm from it. But it was intentionally meant to suppress Black communities and drive up mass criminalization and incarceration. Sorry, go ahead, Reagan.
Great. Great. Are we on the dope? Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the radical legacy of harm reduction. And when I say radical legacy, I mean understanding the work that the Black Panthers and the Young Lords and queer activists and ACT UP really did throughout the 60s through the 90s to establish what we call today as harm reduction. So the first thing I want to talk about is that harm reduction originated as a response to state violence and structural neglect of Black, queer, and impoverished communities. And when I say structural neglect, what I mean by that is that, let's take New York City in the early 70s as like a case study. In the Bronx and Harlem and parts of Brooklyn and just places where rich white people didn't live, healthcare services were really not adequate, and good services were hard to come by. Lincoln Hospital was sometimes referred to as a butcher shop because there was kind of for people to go in for procedures and pass away during the procedures at like a disproportionate rate than at other better funded hospitals. And the building was dilapidated. There were, issues with vermin in the building. And so you just have a situation where people who need care are not being able to access it because the city has intentionally chosen to not invest in their well-being. And what was also going on in New York at that time, a lot of folks with substance use, there was this whole issue of, like, there were people using in the streets, and there were needles in the streets, and there were needles in the park. There's a book that got turned into an Al Pacino movie called The Panic in Needle Park, if anyone's interested in watching that. It's about, this whole era. And so it was in this context that the Black Panthers and the Young Lords started providing more healthcare services. Now, the Panthers had been providing healthcare services, like they were doing lots of great stuff in the Bay, like with their People's Breakfast programs and managing free clinics for people to get access to care. And they teamed up with the Young Lords to really criticize primarily what LJ mentioned, methadone as a means of crime control. They really criticized the fact that the government would give people shorter sentences. They have in the Young Lords newspaper, they're like a monthly newsletter called Parlante, and there's lots of graphics in there about them calling the government big dope pushers and saying that the government just wants to medicate people and isn't really invested in people's well-being or their care. And so in response to that, the Panthers and the Young Lords really wanted to give people who were trying to detox from drugs better options besides just go to a methadone clinic. And, because also methadone clinics, like especially at the time, they weren't warm and fuzzy places, like
They still are.
They kind of still are. So people didn't like going there, and like rightfully so. And so this is another, what I'm about to mention is like a really cool part of this radical legacy. So the Panthers went to China in the early 70s. And through that lesson, when they came back, Dr. Mutulu Shakur, who, as we know, now started the Lincoln Detox program in New York. And through that program, he and the Panthers and the Young Lords and their co-organizers started providing acupuncture and other holistic healing services for people who were trying to detox from drugs. And that was one of the first, I think at least, bless you, in the US, like one of the first successful, like big structural things that people were doing to try to address addiction and substance use and detoxing in a holistic way. They also, in 1970, the Young Lords took over Lincoln Hospital.
Direct action.
Direct action, yeah. It was very planned and coordinated. But yeah, they went in the building, they occupied it, they wouldn't leave for I think a little over a day. And they didn't get all of their demands, but they got a lot. So that was, that's like, when I read about that, that just like blew my mind. And then before I move on, I also want to talk about structural neglect of queer communities during the AIDS crisis in the 80s and 90s. Because I'm sure we've all seen the statistics and the stuff about how Ronald Reagan didn't even say the word AIDS until several years in the epidemic, when it's like tens of thousands of people had died. And so similarly to how the Young Lords and the Panthers were responding to neglect of their communities, queer communities across the country really started organizing ways for people to provide syringe exchange or condom education or just other kinds of healthcare services that were being so stigmatized. And this is something that is it's a really good thing to understand how movements are connected. And like harm reduction really is important for looking at sexual health and queer liberation and drug policy stuff. Mm-hmm. And like HIV is really at the root of that, because one of the main methods of transmission for HIV is when people use syringes that aren't sterile. Like if people are using together, there aren't enough syringes, or people just, they don't have enough to go around, they don't know where they can get any new ones, they don't know how to clean them. People just start exchanging and using the same ones over and over, and that's blood-to-blood transmission that can contribute to HIV transmission. And so because of that link to HIV, harm reduction services have really historically been tied to queer liberation movements and need to continue to be tied to them. We're really seeing kind of like a resurgence of stuff that was happening 50 years ago, like when Nixon was starting the war on drugs. It was very much like a backlash to the civil rights movement, like a kind of rightward swing. And he had a whole thing about getting back to law and order and wanting like everything to be calm and cities to be calm again, which is exactly what we're hearing now with the post-2020 rightward swing, where conservatives are like, America's cities are burning to the ground because of, all of this stuff. And we're kind of seeing an overall rightward shift when it comes to drug policy and queer policy. Like we're seeing all of the Don't Say Gay and anti-trans legislation in Florida and other states at the same time as we're seeing politicians, even in San Francisco with London Breed and Brooke Jenkins, the new DA who replaced Chesa after the recall, launching a war on fentanyl, which really is just going to be a war on individuals who use drugs. It's not really going to, as we all know now, the war on drugs didn't solve anything for overdoses or substance use. And so the war on fentanyl, we don't really have reason to believe that the state's going to do something better when they're following the same playbook that they did decades ago.
Also, fentanyl is literally used in hospitals.
Yeah.
So
Literally, yeah.
Yeah.
If I can add, since we're nerding out with history and like the connection between harm reduction and drug policy, I definitely want to pay homage to the harm reductionists during that time that really utilized medical cannabis in that space, and the amount of patients and people who their quality of life, depending on their situation, was improved because of people like Brownie Mary from California, or Chicago, I believe they're from, and the other harm reductionists who understood that there was actual medical benefits to cannabis, and despite federal laws and the ignoring of that, incorporated that into community care. So definitely want to pay homage, and a lot of those folks were queer. So there's a lot of intersection between queer advocates and activists from that movement that are also a part of the drug policy space to this day. A lot of folks who are actually, I would consider elders in the harm reduction space, who were very active during the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And sorry, okay.
Go ahead.
No, this is a different topic that I wanted to add to.
Oh, I was going to keep going on this same topic.
Okay, so one more thing.
Yeah.
I think this history is extremely important because the way that the federal government now is acting like they care about harm reduction, and our government, even local government, state government, act like they support harm reduction, but they end up trying to define what harm reduction is, and oftentimes it's very limited to syringes and Narcan.
We're going to get to that.
Oh, okay, so
everything's connected.
who gets to say the point?
Sorry.
Keep going.
Well, yeah, so the idea is that it's very important to understand the history of harm reduction, because where we are now, not understanding the history will make it seem like we are actually achieving things that we're not, at least the spirit and the principles of harm reduction. So we have to be very connected to that history, which oftentimes is not told. Biden, it's a good thing that Biden, says the word harm reduction. That's a huge thing, having the president of the U.S. recognize harm reduction, but it doesn't matter if it's not being done the right way. So sorry, I did not mean to do that.
All good. And to Queen's point, I think it's really important to understand that although Biden is using it now and Bowser's using it and it's in the news more often, harm reduction is not new by any means. First of all, just the fact of communities taking care of each other in a healthcare crisis, has existed for as long as there have been people getting sick, But harm reduction, the phrase and the practice and embodied experience that we know it as today, has been at least 50 years old. And so when the state and governments try to use and co-opt harm reduction, it's important to recognize and remember that there's a very robust and beautiful legacy of radical tradition around harm reduction. And so that's something to keep in mind when you see Bowser saying things like, oh, well, all the cops on MPD have Narcan, so I support harm reduction. Oh, no. Oh, my gosh. It was literally born as a response to state violence and medical neglect of marginalized communities. So no, cops having Narcan is not going to fix that. And also talking about queer liberation and drug policy, it's just so important to see how decriminalization of drugs relates to so many other issues. I think one thing that we've really struggled with as politicians DC and nationally will try to paint this as like a really niche, like a hyper niche issue. But really, like, it connects to queer liberation, it connects to immigration policies, like LJ mentioned, it connects to racial equity, it connects to labor laws, like just so many different kinds of things. So it's really like interconnected with so many other issues that many of us are organizing around. So I wanted to make that point. And then, are we on the resources slide? Great, yeah, I just put that up there in case you wanted to learn more. These are things that like taught me a lot about the stuff we're talking about today.
And we'll share the slides with everybody, especially if you add the email, but we'll also send it to whomsoever has the registration list.
Yeah.
Harm Reduction 101. So you heard a lot about like harm reduction as a social movement. You heard about drug policy and like where we're at right now. What is harm reduction? Anyone want to take a gander?
Not being cruel.
Cruel or cool? Okay, I was like, I think we're cool. No, not being cruel. I like that answer. Does anyone else have any other answers?
So tools and services we provide to people that are used to harm, like abuse or addiction. A lot of drugs and people exploitation.
Anything else?
Distinguishing between harmful and not harmful.
Ooh, okay, yeah. Yeah, these are good. Absolutely. So there are 8 technical principles. So like it was in the 1980s where like this one dude in the Netherlands made a very specific coining of the term harm reduction, but as we saw, people have been practicing and organizing around harm reductionist practices and principles for a long time. So like a hill that I swear to God all of the people on steering committee for Decrim Poverty will die on is that it is more than just the tools and practices, although it is also the tools and practices. But that it's a way of being, it's a philosophy, it's a way of moving and caring for people, and it's literally a social movement that we have a legacy that we are not here on our own. We are here because of all of the wonderful people that Reagan was talking about, and some of the amazing advocates that are existing today. I just, every time I meet them, I'm like, why don't everyone have a documentary? But yeah, it was like the late 90s or like early 2000s, I don't know, it doesn't really matter, but it is in the Undoing Drugs book by Maya Salovich, which is also on one of Reagan's reading lists. A group of people got together, it's now formed as the National Harm Reduction Coalition, but before that they came together and a bunch of harm reductionists decided on these 8 principles, which are, I mean, y'all can look at this one, but I'm gonna look at my paper because I can't read upside down. Oh, cool, thank you. Show girl. Okay, so harm reduction principles. Number 1, it's about minimizing harm. We accept that licit and illicit drug use is part of this world. It also affirms any motion towards positive change. So sometimes they'll say like any positive change to kind of flip this narrative around it all being around harm. Sometimes it can be about any positive change. If we're going on
Chicago Recovery Alliance, and Dan Big really coined that one.
Hell yeah, nice. Number 2, some drugs and behaviors are safer than others. So like when I paused for a second for what you were saying, I was having like the wheels stopping for a moment where it was like, yeah, because what is harmful for one person might not be harmful for someone else. And that's vital for the harm reductionist movement that the abstinence-based movement totally neglected. And I was also thinking when y'all talk about the history about like black people, queer people, people of color, like how important they were for mobilizing, I was like, you know who mobilized all those abstinence-based programs and like Synanon and Alcoholics Anonymous? Straight white middle class men. Anyway, that's just interesting. Yeah, so some drugs and behaviors are safer than others. Number 3, the commitment to improving the quality of life, whatever that looks like for an individual. And we are also committed to structurally improving lives, which I think is another point. It's also non-judgmental and non-coercive, so that can be in systems-based things, that can be a formal practice, but it can also just be a way of being, right? That can just be a philosophy on how we move. It also centers community and client voices. This isn't about some person that has a degree in public health or policy or anything else like that. It's about the people who are actually experiencing this and walking along with them rather than telling them how to walk, how to move, where to go. It's about being there with them. There's some great analogies about cars, like I think you're in the back seat, but at the end of the day, you're not driving. But it's not just like willy-nilly, oh, I'm just here and you do whatever you want. It's like helping someone along, but in a non-savior way. You're really with them. But that's why it's also so important to center community and clients, and that's why in harm reductionist social movements, and maybe not the public health model like harm reduction TM, that's why you'll see a lot of people with lived experience working in these spaces also. Number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Number 6, affirms agency. It empowers people who use drugs. It boosts autonomy. What do you want from your life? It's like, man, maybe it is about drugs. Maybe it has nothing to do about drugs. So like, maybe it's like, I want to get my kids back. Unfortunately, a lot of the systems in place will require people to be off of drugs to like get their kids if that's a system that they have to go for. But maybe it has nothing to do with their drug use. And then at a place like HIPS, they'll try to find out like, how can we get your kids back? How can we get you housing? That has nothing really to do about drugs. But of course, systems are real and systems suck. So we still have to navigate some of that. And again, this is one of the best ones, in my opinion, which brought me to the harm reductionist space, is that there's a real recognition of the impact of structural systems and social inequalities like discrimination, racism, classism, and capitalism. Very much, that is rooted, I mean, you heard that in the history, it's rooted in harm reduction as a movement and a philosophy. I actually come from the Narcotics Anonymous background, and it was like people praising jails, praising cops, like saying like God saved them by getting arrested, or like that's an outside issue, we can't talk about how unjust it was that happened, and I'm like, these systems impact my recovery. So it is not an outside issue. But it was really suffocating to be in a community group of people that were supposed to be on recovery that would not address all the other violences and harms that we face all the time. And like, again, mad respect to the people that works for, because I've seen it save so many lives, but it's just not for me anymore. And number 8, risk is real. There's this myth out there that harm reduction is an enabling philosophy or practice. God. It's one that I don't hear as much now that I'm kind of insular, but I heard that all the time in Narcotics Anonymous. It was like, yeah, that's great if you want someone to end up in the ground, or I tell people about safe consumption sites. They're like, man, I just would have used there and never stopped. And I'm like, actually, statistically, even in a harm reduction center like the ones that we want that have all sorts of services and a safe consumption site, most people that are getting connected to resources and ceasing their use and maybe wanting to stop using, get there from the safe consumption site. That is not one of our goals. Our goal is, again, boosting autonomy, affirming agency, but the evidence has showed that more people, once they're in that safe consumption site with a caring and nurturing peer and medical professional oftentimes, that's when people are like, man, I don't want to do this like this anymore. And then they might start to cease their use, or like they're already they're already in there. The fact that they're prioritizing themselves to have sterile works and to have someone near them, they're prioritizing their lives. So they start to realize like, oh, I matter, I'm okay. Mm-hmm. And then what else do you want to do? But like harm reductionists aren't out there being like, yeah, you should come in here because we need you to stop using drugs. It's not a part of it. But just because that's not a part of it doesn't mean that harm reductionists are just cool with people getting hurt. That's literally not even in the word. That'd be like harm affirmanists or something, affirmationists. But yeah, risk is real. We totally acknowledging that. And because we acknowledge it, that's why we can actually like create strategic efforts around how to make life a little better for people who use drugs.
Can we carry on with that for a second? This topic?
Oh,
Yeah, I had a point too. Yeah, this slide is so great. The enabling conversation. Just because that is something that like people who really believe in like sobriety focused treatment programs, they always go in on like, you're giving people the resources to kill themselves, like you're allowing people to ruin their lives. And it's more just like looking at, first of all, telling someone to stop using drugs immediately, or they'll get kicked out of their housing shelter, or they'll get their kids taken away from them, or they'll lose their job, you know. Mm-hmm. That's not really a way to like, if someone's living with substance use like issues in a way that's negatively impacting the way they move through the world on a daily basis, like firing them, evicting them, taking their kids is not going to make their lives better, you know? And so what harm reduction is about is like, okay, how can we make it so that like the way you use substances is not controlling your life or your day-to-day activities, or it's not like, how can we make it so that it's a fun thing, you know, not like a self-medicating thing where you like feel like you need it in order to cope with like the day-to-day trauma.
I mean, shit, even if that is what someone's doing, it's like, that's kind of how I use.
True.
And even if that is what someone's doing, like, let's do it the safest way we can.
Exactly.
Like with either sterile syringes or knowing your dose, knowing your supply, knowing your dealer, not using, I mean, I do use alone, but not using alone. I mean, but if I'm using alone on something that could be problematic, I'd normally text someone and tell them that,
that's harm reduction.
Hey, I'm about to, every time I text Shayna, I'm like, look at me, harm reduction. I'm just like, well, yeah, I mean, that's harm reduction in practice, like on the individual level, is just letting people know you're using or something like that.
And that really brings me to something that like I hear like Miriam Cava and Andrea Ritchie and like TJ folks talking about like how abolition and transformative justice, they're not just like theories, they're things that you really need to apply to your day-to-day lives. Like, who is it? Is it Mia Mingus, who's like the dishes? Does anyone know what I'm talking about? She has this idea where she's like, I think she's based in the Bay, she has a lot of TJ work, and she's like, we can't talk about police abolition and accountability until we start being accountable ourselves in our day-to-day activities. And the example she always gives is like, if you tell your roommate you're gonna do the dishes and then you didn't do them, and your roommate's like, how come you didn't do the dishes? Like, are you gonna blow up and get defensive? You know, like if that's how you're moving in your regular life,
It's like ACAB.
you're not really holding yourself accountable. You're not really embodying abolition and transformative justice yourself. And harm reduction is the same kind of thing, you know? It's not just like a policy for how we want to see the world change. That is it. But additionally, it's like how we want to change ourselves, you know, like a real like Grace Lee Boggs, like transform yourself to transform the world type beat.
And if I could just add to everything that y'all have said, because that was very incredible. But I feel like one thing that the war on drugs focuses on is the harms of drug use. I mean, like literally down to like what we fund. Like we literally fund studies on like the harms of drugs, but we do not fund the benefit, like research on the benefits of drugs. Like whether it's the social, economic, or health benefits of drug use, we don't invest anything on that because stigma and this intentionality behind oppressing people because of their drug use. But actually, this is kind of an unstated fact, but the majority of people who use drugs, not just cannabis, the majority of people who use all illicit drugs do not have an addiction. Like they don't have a substance use disorder. It's actually a minority of folks who struggle with problematic use or chaotic use, oftentimes with cold crime issues happening that go unaddressed. And our whole focus is on this thing that drugs are just completely bad. And I think as a movement, because of the need, the urgent need for harm reduction for the people who are struggling, we don't have time to really talk about the joy that sometimes comes from drug use and the community that comes from drug use and the pleasure that comes from drug use that happens every day. And some people get to enjoy those things all the time because they have a home that they can do it in with no surveillance and no issues. They have all their other needs taken care of. They go to work every day and come home and do whatever drugs that they want to do and don't have to deal with the state interfering. So I just hope folks can, if you don't leave here with anything else, that just disrupt what you may think you understand about drug use if you're not a person who uses drugs yourself. It's more nuanced than the years of stigma that we've collectively as a society have experienced because of our government and this whole war on drugs. But drug use is not always inherently bad for everyone. Actually, the majority of people. So I just wanted to name that as we talk about autonomy and agency. Like, we should have the right to use drugs if that's what you want to do, frankly.
I also want to, go ahead.
I was just going to say there's an interesting internal harm reductionist conversation that it happens amongst a lot of people, but I'm just going to use Dr. Carl Hart and Maya Salovitz as the example because they've literally been in conversation around this, where Dr. Carl Hart will say, like, we need to leave behind the term harm reduction because, like, I mean, we got our own opinions, but, like, and I'm kind of more on Maya's part, but like what Dr. Carl Hart is saying is kind of what Queen was saying is like, it's not all about harm. Like sometimes it's about pleasure. Sometimes it's about experience and community. But then Maya Salovitz is like, okay, but as a political movement and a social movement, I don't want the government telling me what I can have pleasure around. I only want them to decrease the harm involved in my life. So I kind of vibe with that side, but that's some getting into the nitty-gritty nuance of some of the conversations that happen internally.
Yeah, and I just want to, like, touching on what Queen mentioned about, like, challenging what we believe in about drugs. I'll give, like, kind of a personal example, but I think just growing up, and I think this probably is, like, similar for especially, like, Black people who grew up in the past, like, 25, 30 years in the U.S. Like, I felt like I grew up with so much anti-drug rhetoric, like, everywhere. Like, it was in school, it was at church, it was just everywhere I would go, I would hear so much about, like, if you use drugs, your life will be over. Or, like, certain dare type rhetoric, like one hit will change your life forever, and if you take one hit, then you'll never, there's no going back
Such
from
a lie.
that. It's such a lie, but people still believe it.
Yeah,
We've had politicians tell us this.
What is it called? The
gateway
drug
drug.
is not real. It's just
Yeah.
not real.
And
I
I
know we
feel
can talk about that later, but
like
it's not
soft
real.
versus hard drugs is another thing that
God.
we need to be mindful of not making a dichotomy across substances. And I, as a cannabis user myself, I feel like the cannabis environment, the cannabis space often does that. Like marijuana exceptionalism, or even just in general, like the
Psychedelics
plant-based.
too.
Psychedelic
I know.
exceptionalism is a whole
Just
different
the
deal.
plant medicine as if coca
Coffee is a plant.
it's clearly just based from ignorance. If you think heroin is not nature, or cocaine is not nature, but either way, like that, it just like unnecessarily stigmatizes people. But yeah, go ahead.
Even with the amount of anti-drug rhetoric and stuff, one of the problems is that it also made the public and a lot of people think that all drugs are the same. So you come to me, you say alcohol and drugs, and they oh, marijuana is just as dangerous as heroin, or cocaine is just as dangerous as this and this. And to me, as a perfectly young kid at that time, so it's all these drugs are equally dangerous, when some of them are way more dangerous, and you should really never touch them, and some of them are a lot less dangerous, and can actually be used safely.
I think with that, though, it's hard for me to say that one type of drug is inherently more dangerous or inherently more addictive than any other, because a lot of it depends on the way someone is using that substance. For example, to say, we could take alcohol versus heroin. There is a world where someone, Dr. Carl Hart talks a lot about using...
I'll also personally admit I had a much better time with heroin than I do with alcohol. Because I don't have androgenase or whatever the hell it's called, Asian blush, but to the worst version of it, I get hives. I get sick immediately. I feel like I'm in love when I'm on heroin. Just saying.
Dr. Carl Hart talks a lot about using heroin every once in a while in a safe way, with lots of these harm reduction strategies in place, with basically setting up your own safe consumption site, which he can do because he has the resources and want that to be available for everybody. But that's a way where someone's using heroin in a way that it's not condemning their entire life, versus everyone knows.
He's literally a neuroscientist. He's
at Columbia.
Yeah.
Whereas everybody knows someone who has struggled with alcoholism, in your life, in your family, in your community, So I can't necessarily say that heroin is inherently more dangerous than alcohol, because a lot of it depends on why you're using the substance, the way you're using it, the support and the resources you have around you.
You also remember that number I said? It was 108,000 died from alcohol in 2021. Every single drug except methadone, every single one, including antidepressants for some reason, was less than that. 106,000 for heroin, methamphetamines, cocaine, benzos, less than alcohol. So that's a different hill that I will also die on, but but yeah. You want to keep moving?
Yeah.
Okay, because we still got a lot going on.
Yeah, we do.
I had a question about this, but I want y'all to just think about this. What type of practices do you do in your daily life that is a harm reductionist thing? I'm a lot more interested in the conversations around the theories, philosophy, and the social movement and history. I'm an anthropologist, so
Can you tell?
yeah, Jesus. Sorry.
And I'm a historian. Can you tell that?
Cute. Drug policy wonk. But yeah, I do also want to land with the fact that there are some key issues that are more of these tools and practices, which will lead us to more of our drug policy conversation. So key issues for harm reductionists. This is coined by Drug Policy Alliance. Hey, Bankroll, thank you. Discrimination and stigma against drug users is a main thing that people are working against. Drug checking, so that's part of what we'll have at the harm reduction centers. Drug overdose is a hot topic, key issue. Every single year it gets worse. I'm so tired of it. It's really depressing. Naloxone, having opioid overdose reversal drugs, supervised and safe consumption sites and services, and syringe access. Good Samaritan laws are also on here, and I didn't write that. And I just want to say, do you all know what the Good Samaritan law is? Okay, so let me just so there were some nods, some nods, and So the Good Samaritan law is that, okay, say that Reagan over here, good old buddy, we're doing some dope together. As you know, there's literally no heroin out there, which is why I'm like, where's Carl Hart getting his heroin? But there's no heroin, y'all, that's all fentanyl. But Reagan falls out. We're using in my apartment, all of a sudden Reagan overdoses. I don't have naloxone on me for some reason, and I don't know what to do. If I call 911, under the Good Samaritan law, I'm good. Like, say that I'm carrying drugs, I'm good. They will not arrest me. I'm a Good Samaritan, I called about my buddy. Say it's literally my apartment and I'm like right down the street on H Street or something like that. Yeah, I called them, we're good. I just want y'all to be a little careful. I do still implore you that if something like this happens, like, and you don't have naloxone, you don't have the first aid things that you need to do, like, please get that person the wellness they need. It's a good law in general, but they need to be more robust because the cop can and sometimes will just walk around the block and come back up and then arrest me for having drugs. So that's just the realities of what we're living with. And that's another version of like, yeah, we have these laws, but cops still be cops, right?
And the implication of why that law is so important is because people have not called the police or called for help when their friend or whoever has passed or has overdosed because of fear of arrest. Like that is directly speaking to addressing people's fear of getting help for someone who has overdosed. So,
yeah.
The law, it's not a federal law, but it's kind of a state.
yes.
Yeah. So it's in Maryland, it's in DC, Virginia? Yeah, I don't know anything about Virginia, I'm sorry,
I'm not sure about Virginia, but for sure we have in DC. I mean, it's again up to police discretion, but it's on the books at least.
Yeah. And yeah, they could still like recognize you. And I'm not trying to I'd rather have someone call someone, but like we do have HIPs, we have hotline numbers over there. We're trying to create more systems for people, but I also want people to be as safe as they can and do with that as you will with that information. Another question for y'all to think about on your own. I'm going to skip over this one.
Yeah, because we gotta have.
Are just like, what are some examples that you see of the state co-opting radical organizing? Because again, harm reduction, as Biden and Bowser are saying it, is a little different than what we're talking about and what we're trying to move and shake with decrimpovertydc.
And that really brings us to this slide, where I really just wanted to give like a clear distinction between like the kind of sanitized version of harm reduction that local and federal governments have been embracing versus the liberatory harm reduction that like the Panthers and the Young Lords and ACT UP were really focusing on. So as I mentioned earlier, one thing that Bowser's doing is relying on police and encouraging MPD officers to distribute naloxone and fentanyl testing strips. The liberatory harm reduction way to do this would be to establish harm reduction centers where people can get naloxone, fentanyl testing strips, condom, STI, HIV testing, new syringes, and holistic healing services without police presence. That is really based in anti-carceral organizing and really giving wraparound support services. And it takes the onus off of the individual and onto the society and the government at large. The co-opted harm reduction is really about you as an individual need to test your drugs. You need to carry naloxone. You need to do XYZ. Whereas liberatory harm reduction is like, it is the responsibility of all of us to be personally invested in the well-being of people in our communities, and here's how we can do it. Here's how we can make a safe space for that to become commonplace. Another one, and this is really key, especially because the mayor released her budget today. If y'all pay attention to the budget cycle or like the city council cycle, in upcoming oversight hearings, you will hear DBH talk about the mayor's sobering center. Boo, boo, tomato, tomato. And what the sobering center is, it's a place where people, like police could drop off someone who's coming down from a high. They could get case management from the city there. But it's a place that's very clinical. They have 9 beds. How many beds did she say they have? Something like that. And it really emphasizes abstinence and sobriety as a solution to the overdose epidemic. Again, placing the onus on an individual. Like say, this whole crisis of overdosing will stop if you as an individual stop using drugs, or people, decide to take it upon themselves to stop using drugs. What liberatory harm reduction really embraces is safe consumption sites. And these are places where people can use drugs in the presence of trained peer health workers and clinicians that can respond immediately in case of emergency. LJ and I and Shibundo and a couple other steering committee members for the campaign were able to go up to New York about a month ago and see On Point NYC. They recently launched, well, I guess a year ago now, launched a safe consumption site that has prevented more, so this is how many people we lost in 2021 in DC, 567. In On Point's first year of operation, they reversed 600.
I think it was nearly 700.
700.
Yeah.
More.
It was more than 700.
More overdoses than the amount of people we lost entirely.
And safe consumption sites, which is what we're advocating for. Our campaign wants safe consumption sites. We want the mayor to take the money she was going to put into the sobering center.
$9.5 million.
$9.5 million she just announced today, and put it into something like this that is more informed by people who use drugs and really addresses what people know they need to thrive. And then this slide is just some of the texts we've been mentioning. Saving Our Own Lives, Shir Hassan's really great. And then Undoing Drugs, as LJ mentioned, just future resources if you're interested.
Yeah, those are great books. And also, again, there's some Dr. Carl Hart ones, but he's got good stuff if you like him. All right, Queen.
Yeah, we are short on time, so I'm going to try to because I really want to get questions and hear from folks. So I'm going to be talking about the impact of criminalization and decriminalization. So I just wanted to pull a string from what LJ mentioned around alcohol prohibition. Alcohol is going to get dangerous to drink until it was prohibited. When people were making alcohol in their tubs, no regulations, no consumer safety laws, no accountability in terms of the supply, is how alcohol started to become very dangerous to not just consume, but even just try to get. An unregulated market comes with safety issues. So the issues with the drug market, a lot of times even the violence that's often seen in the drug market comes from the fact that it's prohibited. Inherently, it's not that drugs are the cause of the violence. It's literally our laws that are allowing for an environment where violence can happen, basically. So it's a direct result of the war on drugs that we see violence in the market, and we also see a terrible supply that's killing people. So that is currently what we are dealing with. The war on drugs, criminalization worsens overdose risk. So I can speak on the individual impact of criminalization. I mean, there's tons of data that continues to show that even a short time incarcerated, if a person is actually struggling with substance use disorder, that is the worst place that a person could be, in a cage. And we can talk about really no one should be in a cage, but especially someone who is struggling with a substance use disorder. But even systemically, the war on drugs and criminalization worsens the actual drug supply. So it actually makes using drugs riskier and more dangerous than if we had a safe supply. What we're talking about here with a harm reduction center is harm reduction. Ideally, we'd have a safe supply. So people actually know what they're using. They are educated on what dosing actually looks like for substances. Speaking to your question, it's not that drugs are inherently themselves dangerous, it's the lack of education about how to use drugs that makes using drugs dangerous. So the fact that people don't know about mixing certain cocktails of drugs can immediately cause harm. Drinking earlier in the day and then, doing other drugs at night, that mixing can cause harm. And the fact that that's not common knowledge is part of the problem. So criminalization in of itself is worsening our overdose crisis, and that's why decriminalization is a public health strategy. In addition to being a criminal justice reform issue in general, for people who are not even struggling with substance use disorder.
Can I give a quick thing about toxic supply?
Yes.
Just real quick. Sure. The analogy that I like to use is imagine if you had a water bottle in front of you and you knew there was alcohol on it, but you weren't sure if it was going to be white wine or absinthe. That's kind of where we're at right now.
No, quite literally. That's the best way to put it, to be honest.
Or water. It's I think I'm drinking water. It's free laps.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty bad, and I think, again, because of stigma, it makes it hard to engage people with how literally technical this is. This is not about a moral issue. It's not about a person's anything. It's really a person wanted to use a substance and passed away by accident. These are accidental deaths, and they're preventable. So that leaves us hope. People, this is not a doomed situation. If we actually change our laws, we literally can reduce overdose, and it's just that simple. And I mentioned earlier that not every person who uses drugs struggles with addiction, so that's something to keep in mind. And the way our drug policies are spoken about and the way drug use and addiction is even spoken about, you would think anyone who uses drugs like has to be struggling with something chaotically.
Especially illicit.
Yes, well, yes, especially illicit. And I want to be very clear that legalizing marijuana is not ending the war on drugs. Like, we have lots of work to do, and I think a lot of folks think that, like, you know, we're going to end the war on drugs tomorrow because marijuana is legalized, and that's just like completely false. I wanted to speak about the nature of addiction, but just really quickly, like, I think there's a misunderstanding about what it even means to struggle with substance use disorder, and the fact that folks, and policy folks especially, have way too many hands, and like even police have too many hands on top of a medical issue. Like, relapse is very much a part of folks' journey. That's just part of the journey to recovery. And the fact that like our policies like kind of dangle services, housing, food, on like, making it dependent on sobriety is violence. And it's, again, part of why we're continuing to lose people. And wanted to speak about how, you know, just on the justice reform side, we continue to see thousands of Washingtonians locked up every year just for drug possession. And like thousands of people, and the majority of those people are Black people in DC. Regardless of whether or not any of those people have substance use disorder, that is definitely a problem, that our laws are not enforced equally. And they literally and this is data straight from the government, there are areas in Ward 3 where there was not a single arrest for drug possession, and Ward 5, 7, and 8, per usual, like with everything else, continue to carry the brunt of criminalization. And unfortunately, because of the harms of criminalization when it comes to overdose, we also see those areas carrying the most overdoses in the city. It's not that people use drugs in Ward 5, 7, and 8 any more than in Ward 1 and 2 and 3. It's, again, because of how things are treated differently based on where you are and who you are and what you look like. So this is like a very insidious racial justice issue, beyond the fact that it's also a public health issue, beyond the fact that it's also a justice reform issue, because frankly, we don't need to be locking up people just because they have drugs on them. And because drug use and drug possession are one of the leading causes of arrest in general, that takes up lots of resources from police that we could be diverting to literally anything else, but especially harm reduction services. And also, you know, for people who don't even struggle with substance use disorder, or even if they do, an arrest or a conviction, especially a drug conviction, carries so many collateral consequences that even if your life was relatively stable before, an arrest can disrupt all of that. You can lose your kids, you can lose your job, you can lose your housing, or make it extremely hard to get housing. You literally can like be denied licenses, federal grants for school, like federal like FAFSA money, Pell grants, like there's so many collateral, immigration consequences, like marijuana possession is one of the leading offenses deportable offenses. So like drug convictions and drug arrests have such serious consequences beyond a person's like, you know, risk of overdose, that this is extremely important, even if we weren't even talking about trying to end overdose. So like decriminalizing drugs allow people to actually match our alleged want to treat drug use as a health issue with the reality. I don't know how we can actually treat something as a health issue when we are continuing to arrest people for it. Like, I mean, that's like literally the step one of treating it like a health issue is not arresting people for it. And for some reason, that's something that's very hard for our electeds to understand, or at least to like act on, because this like very insidious here, because it's not like people are just opposing it. People understand it, but are too fearful to take the steps to actually just do it. So I think it's more of a political thing than like a understanding thing, which I think is a very, it's a helpful place to be. I mean, it's better than straight opposition, but it's a very fucked up place to be, honestly. As folks who are leading this advocacy, it's like, you understand the problem, but you just don't want to do anything about it. So I'll move on to abolition just for the sake of time. But I did want to speak about how this campaign and this comprehensive approach to treating drug use as a health issue is an abolitionist movement. So part of, you know, envisioning and like fighting for a world without prisons, without cages, means building alternatives to police, like tangible alternatives. For us, and in this specific instance, the roadmap that our campaign has put forth, that we collectively as a community work together to build, is saying we no longer want police to arrest people simply for using or possessing literally small quantities of drugs, and invest in an infrastructure that can increase the health and wellness of people who use drugs. So this infrastructure, the Harm Reduction Center, the drug checking services that we want expanded, the money to peer-led and community-based organizations, all of these things allow us to build up an infrastructure that can address our community's needs without police at all. So, I think sometimes people can't see the theory coming into practice, but this, though, our bill isn't, ending prisons or ending police, this is how we get there. Getting to abolition requires incremental steps. We literally can't just erase prisons by tomorrow. I wish we could. But this is how we get there. In terms of addressing drug use and addiction and health, this is the most abolitionist thing to do. Again, minus actually having safe supply. I think that's the gold star. This is harm reduction and the huge steps are actually ending the war on drugs, which is again no longer arresting people just because they use drugs or just because they may have an addiction.
Yeah. If folks have read Becoming Abolitionist by Jerika Purnell, she dedicates a pretty significant part of the last chapter to talk, a part in the middle and a part of the last chapter to talk about how decriminalizing substance use, as a whole, contributes to abolitionist movements.
And also we need to be wary about the medical systems, extension of the state, public health can sometimes be utilized as another carceral apparatus.
Forced treatment. We don't
Yes,
want that.
that's literally what I was thinking about, was forced treatment, mandatory treatment. This is why we also got to keep an eye on some of the abstinence-based movements that are going on, because that is kind of replacing the model of it, where even this biomedical, it's a disease, is kind of replacing the moralization, because it's still about an individual's inability to do X, Y, or Z because of something inside them. We've just updated the terminology from moral failing, and of course people still use that term. It still exists. It doesn't just shift immediately. But the entire it's a disease in the brain, or it's a disease in the genetics. I've literally had family tell me that it must be genetic because I'm adopted, but it must be genetic because there's no way anything. That's how fucked up it is in my personal life, but also in the world, that's how much people will weaponize this idea that it's you're a defective person, right? They've just changed it to the new model of scientism, which is a little bit of a heady medical apology thing.
Yeah, and if I can just make this very clear, Portugal decriminalized in 2001. We have 20 years of data there. Overdose dropped significantly since then. They were dealing with an overdose crisis, and that's why they decriminalized drugs. They were able to significantly increase people accessing services voluntarily. I think that is the major part that is very important to see, because I think because of stigma, you have this assumption that people who use drugs have no autonomy, don't care about their own lives, don't want to get healthy. If we don't stigmatize people and allow people to feel care and love and compassion, and are actually given resources, people make different choices about everything. So yeah, Portugal is a clear example that we can decriminalize drugs and get people into treatment without forcing them into it. So we don't want to replace cages and jails with what Eric Adams wants to do in New York. That's horrible. But really quickly, before, I think I just want to open up, because I really do want to hear from folks, and I want to be conscious of time. I wanted to define decriminalization versus legalization to also kind of demystify that, because they're often used interchangeably, and they're not the same thing at all. And I think that misunderstanding causes a lot of issues even with advocacy. So decriminalizing drugs means removing criminal penalties for drug possession. That's it. It doesn't create a legal market. It does not create commercialization of drugs. It doesn't change anything about drug selling or being able to purchase drugs. It literally just constitutes removing criminal penalties for someone possessing, depending on how it's drafted, X amount of a substance. So that's what decrim is, and that's what we're asking for, and that is the floor. That's obviously not what we want. We talked about it. Safe supply is what we actually need. A regulated market is what we need. But absent that, people are dying. So at minimum, we should at least not lock them up. Or even if you don't have an addiction, we shouldn't lock people up for substance use or drug use, whatever. So that is decrim. Regulation and legalization are more related to the legal access to a substance. So that's why marijuana was actually technically decriminalized in New York, like in the 70s, but it was never legalized. So that creates like a weird just avenue for police to still harass people, basically. So again, that's part of why in the marijuana fight, decrim was not enough. Like marijuana is a substance that like people need access to. And that's why in DC here, like our fake ass like gray market is like very confusing. Because technically, unless you're a medical patient, which is different now because it's a lot easier to just be a patient at this point, but prior to like the self-certification, there was no legal place to buy marijuana. You can possess it, but where are you gonna get it? And then also like with regulation comes what I was talking about earlier, like safe, consumer safety, like, testing, and potential for education about drug use. Harm reduction is needed for even marijuana, and I think sometimes we ignore that. Like, part of the war on drugs harms is like this lack of education because everything's just bad. So,
And with any amount of misinformation, then you're going to throw the whole baby with the bathwater, which is like, I was like, I smoked weed and it was great. It helped a lot of stuff. And then I was like, everything else I must have learned must have been incorrect. The truth is, it was incorrect. But even if some of it was true, I still wouldn't have believed it because I'd be like, so we just need to give people the actual facts. Because also you're talking about drug users definitely having like autonomy, agency, and the ability to think for themselves. So do kids. So like there's like kid-friendly, like autonomy boosting drug education that DPA works on.
I mean, to Reagan's point, it's the same thing as sex education. Like we can act like kids are not gonna have sex or know about sex or learn about sex and allow kids to end up, making riskier choices about sex. Or we can just teach them about healthy ways to engage in sex when they're ready.
Exactly.
It's literally the same thing when it comes to drug use. It's not to say that we want to encourage drug use in young people or really with anyone. Like, it's up to especially adults, like to make your own choices about your own drug use. But if you are going to use drugs, at least use it in a way that won't harm you, and you can make educated choices about how you use drugs. And it doesn't have to be this weird stigmatized thing, which is what it currently is, which is allowing all of this harm. So really, ultimately, this entire campaign, which I didn't even mention our proposal, which, should I just break it down real quick?
Do it.
Okay, cool. So just really quickly, and then we will open up. Our campaign is both a base building, like grassroots, and legislative campaign. So our agenda is both in mobilizing our community, providing our community political education about the war on drugs, about this need for decrim and harm reduction, and mobilizing especially people who are directly impacted by drug use, addiction, criminalization to build our people power. But our campaign also is looking to introduce a bill, don't really have a name yet technically, but it's called the Drug Policy Reform Act. It's like a fake code name until we have a real bill. But our bill starts with removing criminal penalties for substances. Next, it creates a commission on substance use, health, and safety, which would include people who use drugs, medical professionals, people in the criminal legal space. Like literally, I think 18 people we have on that commission that will take a year to draw that line, like what is personal use for each substance. And again, we didn't want to draw that arbitrarily, which is what Canada did with their little decrim pilot. Like they just kind of drew a line, which has unintended consequences because all drugs are different, and all circumstances are different. But anyway, the commission will come up with the benchmarks. And then we have a whole bunch of justice reform provisions around resentencing, decarceration, expungement. And then we have the huge health infrastructure piece, which is the 24/7 harm reduction centers, drug checking services, and the money, the very needed money to our already existing community-based organizations that are working on behalf of and working with people who use drugs every day. I'm amazed constantly at what organizations like HIPS are able to do with such little funding. And it's a travesty that has to happen the way it does. And I think it's about time we actually fund the people who are doing the work. So that is basically the scope of our bill. Though there's more things, like there's the drug education having to be based on harm reduction and not, prohibition language, sobriety, abstinence stuff. And some data collecting language in there to try to build. Oh, maybe I shouldn't say that. This is being recorded. It's data collecting.
So we're both. It's two-part in that we are removing something, we're removing the criminal penalties, and we are adding a more robust harm reduction social safety net. As shown by these two 24/7 harm reduction centers on each side of the river that will have wraparound services, a referral hub, showers, laundry, clothing, hot food, hot coffee. Hot coffee is really important to me. But, and it will have a garden, the holistic measures that Reagan was talking about with the Young Lords Party at Lincoln Detox. Yeah, like I already said, community garden, that's stuff I care about. But yeah, it's going to be amazing.
Oh, it's going to be beautiful. We're going to be able to employ people who often may struggle to get jobs because of their previous drug use or current drug use, whatever. Like, it's going to be revolutionary, and I'm very excited for the day that we can open up our own centers here. But I really am conscious of time.
And with that, we're going to open the floor. Yes.
Yeah.
So I have an organizer question.
Okay.
So if there are motivated people here today, or the 13 people online, I was going to ask, what do you need from, say, volunteers, from organizations that have joined?
I'm not wearing a wig today.
How can people help your campaign or get involved?
Right on. So I'm lead organizer. So you can always text or email me, prefer the email, ljsislin, SISLEN @drugpolicy.org. It's also on the slide at some point. But our main initiative right now is called Wheat Paste Wednesday. If you're not familiar with wheat pasting, I hope that DSA is familiar with wheat pasting. But I will just describe it anyway. It's DIY glue that's biodegradable. We post flyers everywhere. I'm noticing that when we have a large group of people, it's really great for our community building. I might start to do some things with smaller teams so that we can really get in touch with the communities that we're pasting, because we've had some wonderful conversations. So it's three-part: community building internally, community building externally, and political education. And it's really fun if you want to do some like graphic design with us, or to like have your art posted around. We can like work with you with that. That's the main thing that we have every single Wednesday except tonight because I'm here, and next week because I'm at that legalization forum. But we have a link that I can send to everybody where you can sign up for that. We're also about to start our canvassing, and our canvassing is going to be fun because I swear to God, the two things I care about a lot in this organizing position is making it cute and making it fun, because let's be real, this shit's really serious and it fucking sucks. I mean, it's difficult. So like, I want it to be cute and fun. So like, you know, by the time we get to October, we're going to do some like Halloween-based stuff with like, oh, we're all going to have like stations and go out in teams and wear costumes and do our canvassing. But yeah, no, just make it like incentive-based. I like video games, so I'm like, I got to get to the next round. But yeah, we're also like, we could use any support with creating events. I'm about to create an event calendar for the entire year so that we can like not decide to do an event 2 weeks before it happens like I normally do. And really mobilize around like Support Don't Punish, which is a rally in the summertime, Overdose Awareness Day, which is August 31st. I want to do a lot of stuff around Recovery Awareness Month, which is September, because it's an abstinence-based month. I want to take it over. It's going to be harm reduction. But yeah, so phone banking, we're paused on phone banking right now, but if you have any experience with that, please hit us up, because we'd love to have some people leading on that. We also have incentives built up for individuals that decide to mobilize other folks. It's not comprehensive at this time. It still needs just like the final okay, but there are incentives here, which will be like financial or supply based. But yeah, the main ones right now are wheat pasting, canvassing, and general things around events, whether it's either event support, like setting up, doing tech. I also always add on my stuff like, are you a DJ? Are you a graphic designer? Are you an herbalist? I just hit up someone from HIPS to see if we can do another herbalism training. I like to do Narcan trainings in the garden at Temperance Alley. We're always trying to do, again, like cute, fun, and creative, but also like really meaningful, because like we'll literally have holistic stuff in the centers. This is about everybody. It's about community, and it's not for nothing. I'm also thinking about doing some sort of wheat pasting thing or canvassing thing on bikes. Where like we can get together on bikes or roller skating, or go to like Anacostia Skate Park and do some stuff. But yeah, I'm always down to like think with people around it, and just hit me up. We'll find a place for you to get involved.
And I'll also add, I want to add for people who may not have capacity, and then also organizations, and also for policy support potentially. If you're a person who has capacity or time to help with the steering committee, like we need help all the time. So there's always so much shit to do. So like if you're a person who writes and does research or like that kind of is your jazz, like definitely hit us up too. Like plenty of space for just individual concerned community members to join the steering committee. And then separately, if you are affiliated with an organization that's not already a part of the coalition, please hit up LJ or I believe our like general email is info@decrimpovertydc.org. decrimpovertydc.org. info@decrimpovertydc.org. So hit us up and please sign on to our coalition and join us. And then lastly, if you don't have capacity, at minimum, fill out our petition. It sends a message to your council member. Feel free to tweet or retweet stuff from our Twitter, like follow us on Twitter. We're going to be having an Instagram soon. Shout out to Reagan. So just engage with us on social media, up our shit on social media, and contact your council members when you can. If you're already like in touch with council members, just mention it, even if you're talking about other stuff. But all of that goes a long way. So
Yeah, and keep talking about it with your friends, your family, random people on the street. I mean, like, I literally can't not talk about it at this point.
Yes.
yes. And one more note for people who may not have capacity. Just consider our language. That's the one thing I always try to leave with people. Like, how we speak about people who use drugs, like that also matters. Like, that's also a part of this work, like destigmatizing drug use. Like, do not contribute to stigmatizing a person, or, you know, we don't call people crackheads and things like that, like TW, sorry, but like
Dirty or clean.
yeah, dirty, clean, like just be conscious of our language. It may seem like it's nothing, but it does make a big difference if we collectively as a community no longer use, you know, language that is hurtful and harmful.
Chibundo?
Oh, fuck, sorry.
Yeah, I was going to mention,
Okay.
if you're a policy
Thanks,
wonk, if you're interested,
We're still doing testimonies?
Yes.
yeah, because
I'm new to policy, sorry. I'm new to policy.
because the testimonies before were like how things went last year, and the upcoming testimonies are going to be about the mayor's budget that dropped today and what
Yes.
we're going to fund in the next year.
How can
So
I forget?
if you're interested, you can email LJ, who can.
I didn't even know. Sorry, yes. Please email me if you're interested in
You can
that.
email me also, dunham@wapdc.org.
If it's helpful, you should just get general email, so like
Yeah, info at. It's still me.
decrimpovertydc.org.
the
Yeah,
website.
I was like, we got weird names.
Yeah,
so.
but if you have questions about policy and
Please specify.
testifying, that would
It's
be
actually
really,
kind of
really
fun. I've never done it before, and then I did 3
Yeah.
this year, and it
You
was
got
great.
this.
Talking to your ANC and the TCMs, because ANC and TCMs are different than law, especially more fun.
Yes, agreed. If folks didn't hear, Chibundo mentioned that we also need support around ANC commissioners. For folks who don't know, that those are your advisory neighborhood commissioners. They're also elected officials down to like neighborhood level. So they have meetings monthly, and those meetings are where a lot of action happens, and council members listen to ANC commissioners, and ANC commissioners listen to you.
Especially 5 and Gray's 7.
Any of them, wherever you
all
live,
of
just go
them,
to your
honestly,
commissioner. Like, if they have not passed a resolution, they have the ability to introduce a resolution in support of our bill and our campaign. Get them to that. And if you need more support around that, we can definitely help. So please reach out. That's another thing to reach out to us about. If you have capacity to go to your commission meetings, please let us know, because we need folks. You can't be everywhere.
Did you have a question?
Yes.
You mentioned there is a draft, right? Or
Yes.
has it been introduced?
No, it has not been introduced. We're trying to get it introduced. It's been over a year.
Sorry, that wasn't really my question.
Okay.
My question was more like, you talked a lot about, part of it was answered, part of my question was answered when you mentioned attention, setting, where that line is. So a lot of that line is how you determine the difference between, as far as I know, I'm not, but as far as I know, that's how you determine the difference between possession and distribution. Am I understanding that right?
Yes. Yes.
So-
Or possession with intent to distribute.
Yeah, so I'm trying to, I mean, I will listen to those eventually, like,
We're right here.
yeah, but at the same time, I'm just trying to find out, as your first step, so how do you,
I have an answer to that.
to the other,
Yes.
property or the other?
So we, and when I say we, policy advocates, have learned our lessons from marijuana. What happens with marijuana decrim essentially is that marijuana possession charges dropped significantly, but possession with intent to distribute charges increased significantly. And of course, there's still racial disparities, and actually that charge is worse than just possession. So like that was a terrible unintended consequence. So we actually already baked in a provision in our bill to address possession with intent to distribute. So technically, there shouldn't be criminal penalties for someone in possession up to 10 times the actual amount that ends up being determined, to try to mitigate that kind of middle ground between, you know, what is considered personal use and that kind of PWID area. So I'm not sure that it actually has been done yet. This is something, a brainchild of actually an attorney at BPA who also wants to like make sure we are not creating harm by accident. So there isn't supposed to be penalties, or not, if it's not, sorry if I get this wrong, but it's not that there's no criminal penalties, but there's other factors taken into effect for people who are in possession up to 10 times the amount, which hopefully can reduce kind of the criminal consequences of that possession.
So just what I'm understanding, right? So the commission will set that number, right?
Yes.
And then, so if a charge, a higher charge, it's only 10 times that. That would. Yeah.
So technically, if you are in possession up until the threshold, there are no criminal penalties at all. Like you shouldn't even be bothered at all by police or anyone. You can have up to that amount. If you are now in possession between the personal use quantity and 10 times that amount, you're now in this window of not necessarily, yes, or other factors being taken into account as to like whether or not, you know, you'd be charged with, you know, higher like actual distribution charges. Unfortunately, like drug seller reform is a very difficult issue. It's something that at least DPA wants to start working on, but we aren't there yet because we can't even decriminalize drugs. So people are not ready to talk about sellers. Yeah. Frankly.
I think we're still in the part where like legislators think that everyone who distributes is like Pablo Escobar. You know, like that's what's
quite literally.
The reason I was asking is because it's still like they're still going to criminalize.
It's not perfect, but this.
But that 10 times is being.
Yeah, shout out to Greg Gardner at DPA.
Are there any more questions from Zoom? Or?
Yes, there are 2 questions from Zoom.
Let's hear it. We'll take those 2, and then we'll stick around afterwards, and we'll get some swag over there, pamphlets, and fun things for donation, and some postcards if you want to give service and talk to your council members through that way.
So this question is a follow-up to a comment that I said, correctly the words to reading.
Okay.
Were there the same number of overdoses as, say, Ward 7? What's the relationship between arrests and overdoses and other, like, harm?
We tend to see higher overdose rates in areas that are also overly criminalized. And that's because of what I was describing about the implications of criminalization on individual health outcomes, in addition to just systemic issues like under-resourcing of communities. So it's very systemic, as well as the consequences of, like, for a person's individual health because of criminalization. So it's not that people in Ward 5, 7, and 8 who happen to be criminalized use drugs more and like somehow are more at risk of overdose. People in Ward 3 are also using drugs. They just are not being criminalized for it. Not nearly to the extent that people in Ward 5 and 7 and 8 are. So I hope that clears that up.
Yeah, thank you. Second comment is from Lee, who writes, I understand that decriminalization movements focus on decriminalization, not legalization, in order to stop more state control and more interaction between police and people who experience criminalization. How does the supervision proposal for investing our tax dollars in state consumption fund navigate the pitfalls of government involvement? Or in other words, what are things we should advocate for criminalized drug users' autonomy, states' best interests? Would you recommend any government investment around this issue?
That is a great question.
That's a long-ass question.
That is a great
Queen,
question,
you can take that one.
and the answer is the government shouldn't be running our center. It should be contracted to people already doing the work, and the money that the government is investing in the center should expand currently ran services, but the government shouldn't be running. Like DBA,
we want it to be like HIPS. If you're familiar with HIPS at all, we want it to be like HIPS, but better than it is as it is. We want the people to be paid better than they are right now, and we want to be expanded in a way that is, oh, that was weirdly AA, but sufficient on their own without the government's assistance, but we will take government dollars. HIPS is already like used to taking government dollars without, and like other harm reduction organizations too, this is not unique to HIPS, this is all harm reduction, taking some government dollars but using it in a way that they still have autonomy.
Yeah, I mean, it should be a procurement situation. Like, they should have nothing to do with it. When DVH does programming, no offense, but...
I mean, like, I don't know about other harm reduction organizations and like, but like, I mean, we'll say this in the volunteer training at HIPS, so I'm gonna say it, but like, they'll even say no to some money because of, like, they'll be like, we want drug testing in this. And they're like, we don't believe in drug testing, fuck that. And they won't take the money.
Drug testing isn't like testing
like
people.
Testing the staff.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
not,
like
not
they will
like
literally like
checking
so
the substance itself to see what
yeah,
it is,
so like as long
drug
as
testing people.
Exactly, yeah. So I mean we don't really
So it should be
yeah,
no
sorry,
barrier. You should not force people in the centers to be drug tested.
Test.
Basically, I mean, yes. That's how you do it. That's a very easy answer, to be honest.
Thank you. And there was one comment from the Zoom from Ellie who says, I'm a nurse at Whitman Walker Health. One of the harm reduction initiatives we're working on is a vending machine that contains peptides, et cetera. You don't charge at the vending machine, but it requires a code to be given out. Our way of working around what our company allows.
So excited about the
We are
vending
very
machines.
excited.
Those have been in the works for so long.
And I didn't get to talk about this, but very quickly, like, it's like really nice to hear and acknowledge, like, we are able to actually distribute sterile pipes and vending machines.
Especially at like Whitman Walker, like that rules.
I mean, fentanyl testing strips were literally illegal a couple years ago. Like, we've actively had to decriminalize substance, like paraphernalia, but tools by tools by tools. So like, fentanyl testing strips in 2018 were permanently decriminalized finally, after years of advocacy, which made it temporarily decriminalized because of the opioid crisis. We were able to decriminalize all paraphernalia by 2020. Again, 2 more years of advocacy. So now HIPS and other community groups can give out sterile pipes and other, harm reduction tools that were previously criminalized as paraphernalia. So that's just another example of the impact of criminalization. It like made it so it would be illegal for HIPS to give out fentanyl testing strips in the middle of an overdose crisis. Like, our laws are not based in science often when it comes to drug policy, and our effort is just trying to mitigate that by actually grounding it in science and also acknowledging the lived experience of people who are actually impacted by this. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time. We'll be around. 5 o'clock for ourselves.
And I'll just close out with saying thank you to our incredible panelists. Truly, y'all are the experts in this field, and I learned so much and challenged my own way of thinking of drug policy, so I appreciate that. And one thing that did strike out to me is y'all's testament about like not making it an individual issue and not putting the onus on the individual, and I think that's something that's super cool about being in the socialist movement, is that we're here to make people's lives better. It's for pleasure, not to escape a reality that's so harmful that we want to be outside of it, and so I think imagining a world where everyone's lives is just better in every aspect is what y'all touched on and made it intersectional, and that's what we do in our movement work. So I appreciate all of y'all being here. Greatly appreciate y'all. If you're interested, please get involved in HIPS, please get involved in Metro DSA. We'll send out all the information over the emails, but really appreciate all of y'all's work on this, and we're just so excited for all the stuff happening locally. So yeah, thanks for coming.